So our text for this morning comes from the book of Luke, chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. Then they arrived at the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. As he stepped out on land, a man of the city who had demons met him. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house, but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you do with me, Jesus, Son of the God Most High? I beg you, do not torment me." For Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many times it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demons into the wilds. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion." For many demons had entered him. They begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss. Now there on the hillside, a large herd of swine was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus to let them enter these. So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. When the swineherds saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came out to see what had happened, and when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." So he went away throughout the city, how much Jesus had done for him. Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. I almost feel the need to apologize to you all this morning for choosing the text on demon possession. I'm sure you did not come to church this morning planning on diving into some of the hardest content in the Christian scriptures. We have actually been diving into some biblical supernatural events in the last few weeks in this season of Pentecost. And to me, I don't know about you, but it's starting to feel a little intense, especially in our modern day, Midwestern, progressive, not typically evangelical context. We don't talk about these things, and I'm starting to understand why. Writing this sermon was one of the hardest things I've ever done. We don't experience demon possession as described in the Bible, so a text like this seems far off. It can be written off as something that was done in biblical times, but doesn't really mean anything to us today. It doesn't feel accessible. Pastor John and I have been reaching in the last few weeks to make sense of events that are just a little too far out there to have a clear purpose for us. Maybe it's working for you and maybe it isn't. I acknowledge and sympathize with you that it is hard to resonate with something that has no correlating experience in your own life. To be honest, in writing the sermon, I realized I had some of my own past experiences that I needed to make sense of in light of this text. Experiences that I haven't exactly taken time to process simply because I don't know where to start or what framework to use. The religious context in which we find ourselves doesn't really offer help in navigating the supernatural, like demon possession, exorcism, speaking in tongues, or miracle healings. Reading and studying for this sermon forced me to look at some of my past experiences and ask questions I know I didn't have the answers for. And in honesty, I still don't have those answers. But know that this sermon is teaching me as much as I intend to teach you. I'm hoping this is something we can navigate together. So to start, I want to tell you a bit of my story. So I was a young high school girl, going far away from my comfortable and privileged context on a trip with all of my best friends, including my crush, who, spoiler alert, I married. We were headed to Quito, Ecuador for a short-term mission trip with very little expectations about what we were going to be doing other than to have fun and make memories. What else are short-term mission trips for anyway? But from day one, this trip started down a path that even our youth leaders could not control. If you have ever been on a mission trip, either as a youth or with youth, you know that usually things are planned very carefully. Usually you get up and do some kind of manual labor, then you do a VBS with one of the local churches, and then you come back and do worship services with your group in a way that feels comfortable. And those worship services are usually carefully planned out and sort of build up to this night in the latter half of the week that is so intense and is deemed as cry night, where it's so powerful and every young person is ready and willing to give their life over to Christ again. And everyone goes home, changed, and renewed. This was the pattern for every trip I had ever been on. Except for this one. Early on, this trip deviated from that pattern. And what I don't know, being that I was one of the youth, is that if this was a known deviation or if our leaders were just as in the dark as we were. I don't know if they knew that this trip would be different or if it just got beyond their control. We did do VBSs in the morning and would then be shuttled off to small Ecuadorian communities where people living in poverty and in strife and in pain would request prayers for healing. And this isn't like we do prayer requests here. This was gathering up in a circle, laying hands, and loud, spontaneous prayers with what I believe led to real manifestations of the Holy Spirit. Then we would go to worship nights with the Ecuadorians in their own worship contexts, where again, worship usually got to the place of healing prayers and even tongues. And instead of being led in our own comfortable style of worship, we were led in worship by people who seemingly regularly experience these supernatural events. On multiple occasions on this trip, we as high schoolers were part of events that we only knew of as existing in the Bible. We were laying hands. We were praying healing prayers. Others in our group were maybe speaking in tongues. And others yet were experiencing manifestations of the Spirit. And I remember many times this all developing so quickly and honestly felt to me like a moving train no one knew how to stop. If I place myself now in the shoes of those youth leaders, I have to imagine there were occasional moments of panic and concern around how to explain what was happening. In fact, I know that this is true because there had been a letter that had gone out from our youth leader to all of our parents explaining many of the events that had occurred on the trip, and in a way was apologizing for them. And in another way was offering support in the form of being willing to answer questions or engage in theological dialogue, even though our youth leader himself admitted he didn't have an explanation. That's all I really remember about the follow-up of this trip, I think because none of our leaders, and my parents certainly, never brought it up because I don't think they knew what to say. Therefore, these memories just sit in the recess of my mind, only brought up when passages like this come forward and raise my unanswered questions. Perhaps some of you have had experiences like this that you hold close. Perhaps this feels foreign to you. Honestly, these are my very real experiences, and they still feel foreign to me. Regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, to me it feels like we have no box to put these experiences in. Do we put them in the cultural differences box? Like these things only happen when we're out of our context. For a while, I believed that to be true. Do we put them in the spiritual box? Like you have to be a certain level spiritual to access these events. I think some do believe that. Or do we put them in the theological box, where we try to explain them with knowledge and logic? I think the denomination I grew up in believes that. Or do we put them in the denomination box, like only some denominations or strands of Christianity have access or the know-how to draw up spiritual events. And I think some also believe that. Or, and I think that this is where I am now, do we put them in the unknown box? The box of questions to be answered when we finally see Jesus. But if that's the best box for these events, then what the heck do we do when we have to read these passages and inevitably draw up on confusing events of our past? Temporarily putting them away isn't going to help us understand. In our text this morning, the man possessed by demons was trapped in his current condition. He was forced into self-harming behaviors and was isolated from his community for fear of him harming others. He was experiencing a living death, a life totally separated from normal people and normal living. And then Jesus comes along, harnessing all of the power of God to save, casts out the demons, and sends them to the pigs. In the end, the man had been healed. Now, the Greek word used for healing has deeper meaning than just the one English word the translators chose, which I think some of these other meanings change the narrative. That Greek word could also mean saved or delivered or made whole. The man was not only cured or healed from this burden, but was actually brought into a new reality where he was saved and made whole. He now was not only able to join his community again, but he was changed and brought into the community of God. He is now one of God's own. He was saved by being made clean of his demons, but was made whole by coming into the presence of the power of Jesus. Being freed from our demons simultaneously saves and welcomes us into the fold of God. I prefer this emphasis on being saved and made whole as a way to end this passage. Because aside from these one-off unexplained experiences we may or may not have had, we are not encountering demons. But that is not to say that we are not encountering things that are trapping us, that are burdensome, that are destroying life, that are forcing us into self-harming behaviors, that are separating us from loved ones and our community, things that feel like a living death. We may not encounter demons like we hear in this passage, yet we do have demons of our own. We are in need of that healing, of that saving, of that wholeness. We are suffering from things like addiction, mental illness, consumerism, pride, elitism, the list could go on. Our demons look and act very different, but we are bound by them just the same. The good news of this passage is that Jesus does have the power to save us from these demons. Jesus is stronger than the things that hold us down and separate us from one another. Jesus' ministry on earth and his work on the cross was to bring us back together, whole and free from our chains, to break us free from what is keeping us from living into our most full and lively selves. This is true of those in the Bible that were ridden with literal demons, whatever that even means, and those of us now who are just confused about the idea of literal demons, but full of them no less. I think passages like this sort of intentionally distract us by forcing us to be confused about demon possession rather than introspective about what demons look like for us today. I want to use the example of the model of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm sure you're mostly familiar with the 12 steps of the program, the ones that are used for many types of addictions and I think could be used for many types of vices. They're ones that have definitely proven their effectiveness and have now become sort of a best practice for therapy techniques. The 12 steps start with an acknowledgement of what is holding you down. What addiction is holding you back from living your fullest life? This is the first and most powerful step for a reason. How can we begin to address a problem unless we acknowledge that there is one? If we're always distracted by questions of how healing prayers work. We won't ever take the time to address what healing needs to occur in our own lives. Then, many of the steps that follow that first step are very therapeutic and healing in nature. They bring a person into fuller understanding of the impact their addiction has had on their life and what changes need to be made. They're healing centered in that, one, they bring a person back to their community. It is critical for healing that we are surrounded by people who love and care about us. So you see that in the step that requires making amends with your loved ones. Two, they admit to the control that has been given over to the addiction, to the way that they're living a living death because of forces stronger than themselves. But that healing comes from releasing that control. And three, giving it over to God. There's a step that acknowledges the need for the power of God, or a higher being is the actual language used, but this idea that a God-like figure is the only source powerful enough to break a person free from the chains of addiction. God is the only source loving enough to restore a person back to wholeness. God is the center of our healing. God casts out our demons and molds us into image bearers once again. I use this as just one example of how God works within us to remove our demons, how God saves us. It's the process by which we first acknowledge that we are not living our life to the fullest and that we are powerless over what is controlling us, but that God has the full power to release us and does, in fact, release us towards greater fullness and, in the end, abundant life, if we let him. Now, this is going to take a little bit of a different turn. As I wrote those very words this week, I got word that a friend of mine from seminary had committed suicide. Talk about timing. And as we usually do when someone passes away, I spend a moment staring at my own words, trying to find meaning. And I just realized, trying to make sense of God's power amidst our tragedies. And I just realized I needed to offer a disclaimer, because I know some of you are probably hurting, and maybe this touched a nerve. All this talk about demons might be triggering you or tugging at your gut in some way. And I want to acknowledge and hold that pain. I can get up here and say literally anything, but it is still one-dimensional because all of our experiences are different. And there is just a lot that we don't know and don't have the capacity to figure out. Like why some fall prey to their demons and other God is able to save and return to full health and humanity. That's one of those greatest mysteries. And I just need to say that in all of it, God is powerful. I believe everything that I said up until this point to be true. But that doesn't mean that sometimes unexpected things don't happen. But at my core, I believe that God does have the power to heal, to save, and to make whole. And that is what he is doing in each and every one of us if we let him. Now, I haven't really answered my own questions about my own experiences with the supernatural, and perhaps I never really intended to. Maybe this wasn't an answers-based sermon, but an anecdotal one cracking the shell just a little bit. Perhaps by finally publicly sharing that story and expressing years of confusion, I released one of my demons, the one where I need to know everything. Perhaps that is one reason God gave us each other, in hopes that we would share our burdens, our woes, our anecdotes, and help each other seek God in them, and to support one another in our journeys of giving God our demons and moving towards fuller life. a life that we get to live together, as beautiful and messy and confusing as it is. That's part of being human, part of doing life together. I'm thankful that we get to walk together as we allow God to make us more good and fully human. Amen.